Yes, and Manchuria, and then farther left. This period between 220 up until about 589 was a very disruptive period in China. It had broken down since the collapse of the Han Dynasty. Now, what is very interesting is that what remains is the tradition of China, the tradition of the ancient traditions of the Zhou and the Han, both pre-Han, early Han and late Han. And those traditions are embedded and cultivated by a minority of people, basically who become the aristocracy of China. And this is not a discussion that people really understand or even are aware about, the Chinese aristocracy. But there is indeed one, and it's similar to any aristocracy in the world that we would have. So we're looking at four things. The rise of an aristocracy who's preserving the traditions of the ancient traditions. We're looking at also the same, because of this disorder, the nature of warfare and the result of warfare. And we're talking specifically about human bondage and slavery. And we are talking about also the decline of Confucian principles, the decline of Confucian principles, because now everyone is into themselves. They're doing their own thing. Chaos surrounds us, and so let's just simply do our own thing and survive. Almost a survival of the fittest kind of mentality. You know, I was thinking, my history students were asking me the other day, on Thursday, that terrible day, with snow, and we were talking about history, which we have a tendency to do, and I thought, you know, since time of Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, we haven't changed in the past 10,000 years or so. Human nature hasn't changed, and that's a topic for a future discussion. And again, we talked about it regarding Confucius Mencius and his critics. Is human nature good or bad? Well, let's just look at the objective facts of history, if we may. So we see objectively here the rise of an aristocracy. We also see the decline of Confucian principles. We see the rise of bondage and slavery. Now, it's very interesting to see how in Chinese history there would be slavery. Yes, indeed. In human history, there is slavery. It reminds me of the question, how does one approach history with knowing the facts of the human person, human nature? How can we make such broad judgments about her historical past, considering the conditions of time, place, maybe lack of education, all those things, and power? Is a very important question. And as a result, we see the rise of religion. And this is not to equate religion as a means. And though many authors, many of my contemporaries, colleagues, senior colleagues, would argue that religion is something to fill in the gap or something, I don't think it is. But be that as it may, when I talk about religion, we're talking about Buddhism. And I would love to give a little talk about Buddhism. I'm not a Buddhist by any means. I'm not good enough to be a Buddhist. But I think it's important for us to understand basic principles of Buddhism and the impact that it had in Asia that is enduring to this very, very day. To this very day. So when we look at this period from the collapse of the Han Dynasty to the emergence of what will come in the early 6th century. So we're talking roughly quite a long time, 200, almost 300 years of chaos. The individuality of peoples begin to dominate and enforce and create separatist states. And this is unnatural to China. And I'd like to just give you a quote here where we have basically the emergence of individual military rulers who want to impose their will but justify their might by historical pedigree, whether it be through lineage or through culture. And this is a very important point for us to keep in mind, is how does one justify one's position in terms of power? So keep that in mind in terms of what is the nature of power. And I, of course, in keeping this within the context of Confucius and Buddhism. So in other words, we have a period here of almost 250 years of kings, military leaders vying for dominance, and yet they're still seeking to basically, let me quote something here, they possess the desire to create imperial institutions, but not the ability to concentrate power. It's not only the inability to concentrate power, they don't have the legitimacy. So where does that legitimate line, how does it carry on? And may I ask you, how does, when we're looking at powerful cultures, where is the source of legitimacy? How does it carry on without military power and without maybe necessarily political power? How is it carried on? May I ask you? Yes?
It's got to be through the will of the people that are ruled. If they don't like it, they're going to rebel. Even in Russia, France, we have a little bit something going on in this country now.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking, yes, we have will of the people as one answer. Anyone else? Yes. Religion. Yes. Okay, two. Anyone? Yes.
Well, we have a constitution in this country.
Okay, I wish I had a blackboard. I'll write them down here, wait. Let me write them down. Now we're getting somewhere.
He wishes he had a blackboard.
We're getting somewhere. So,
Every week he says he
we've
wishes he
got
had a blackboard.
will of the people,
I didn't bring one.
will, and then we had, we had will,
Religion.
religion,
I wish you had one.
constitution, I'm sorry, yes. Yes,
Military power.
military power, that's going to come
So
up.
if one,
That's
if
gonna
if
come up.
one guy gets an army and the other one doesn't have it, nothing else
Right,
probably
and
counts.
that's going to be a focal point for today.
We always have freedom. We
Freedom,
always think we have freedom and the fight for freedom.
fight for freedom. You know, the Japanese never heard a word for freedom until maybe 100 years ago, 20 years ago, 120 years ago. They didn't have the word for freedom.
That's interesting.
So here's a discussion, Wittgenstein, I'm not going to sidetrack, but we take things for granted in the sense that freedom, and look at perhaps my students, my younger, I mean I'm talking about teenagers, I've got 18-year-olds, and when if I were to ask them the nature of, have they read the Federalist Papers? Have they read them? They will, in my class, they will read my Federalist Papers. They will get to know what the meaning of freedom is. But freedom is a delicate concept, very delicate concept. What is the line between freedom and anarchy? You see? Now we go back to our Constitution, which you were talking about. So keep these common terms in mind in terms of dealing with ancient China. Because going back to what I was saying, when we look at what is ancient isn't so ancient. Human nature is what we have for the past, 10,000 years? In terms of record keeping? Yes.
What did the emperors do
Yes.
in China, other than, I guess, fight off the nomads from the Gobi
Right,
Desert?
right.
What would their government actually do?
Right.
Like right here, we can get medical care from the government and all kinds of stuff. Well, what did they do?
Yeah, the best answer to that is the idea of the mandate of heaven. Keeping that as a weak, as abstract as that may sound, we're looking at not simply a division or a delegation or relegation of authority. We're looking at a moral responsibility to care for the well-being of the idea of a state, people within the state. Boundary, these are geographic boundaries. We're not talking in modern political terms. We're talking in what will become understood as our boundaries. This is my turf. See, that leads to war, of course, as you know. But the cultural boundaries and the cultural influence is so key to understanding the moral obligation, the moral component of the imperial rule, of the imperial household and its administrators. I was going to say ministers, administrators. So if someone is dying in famine, well, let's open up our silos. Let's open up access to water and to food and distribute it. That's a normal, moral concern. It's not necessarily communist. It's not necessarily, we'll get into that. We're kind of getting into our 20th century, 21st century ideas of moral responsibility. But I think within the Chinese concept, and what's important for us also is to understand the nature of historical memory. And that's very important because it, in many ways, it defines how, I find it very interesting that people go to these, what do you call these, websites. I don't know what they're called, the genealogical and biological websites. X2, what it was, 23 or something.
Yeah, ancestry.
I don't know, what's it called?
23 and me.
Yeah. And then they want to know, and then the other one is the other history or something. That's very good. So, and there's a TV program, the professor at Harvard. He's very interesting. This is very interesting. I haven't had time to look into those details, but we want to know where we come from, don't we? But why? Why do we want to know our identity? Is it really that we want to know our identity? What is it? You tell me. So that's another question that you put up there in your list of things. But I hope I answered your question. Now the thing is, you see here, we have what's going on here with the breakdown of the Han Dynasty. We have confusion. We have basically, I'm not a cynical person, to be quite honest with you, but looking at our world, I'm beginning to wonder, where is our confidence in people? Where is our trust in people? And I will never give up that. That's me. Even the worst thing could happen, I still don't think it's the meaning of things. And bad things happen every day. Never where to go. But the thing is this, in political terms, how do we carry on that genealogy of imperial rule? Who is going to basically be legitimate as a ruler? Who's going to be the emperor of China after the collapse of a very important 400 years? Now, I guess what I could ask you is to compare it with Rome and the collapse, the rise and the collapse of Rome. When you were in high school, I'm sure you read Gibbons and things like that. So we have basically the same kind of historical thing happening here in China. And maybe people will call this medieval China. But then look at medieval Europe and look at Charlemagne. Who was really the king? And the attempt to make Charlemagne the holy Roman emperor, none of which he was. He wasn't holy, he wasn't Roman. He wasn't. It's as simple as that. He was a German or some Frankish, something like that. But the continuity of it, that's the question. Continuity, yes.
Not to be a cynic.
Oh,
But-
no, you're talking to,
No.
not a cynic, but maybe.
No, well, I am a cynic.
Oh, okay.
But historically, the people in power had the monopoly
Well,
on
that's it.
violence.
True.
And
That's-
so
that's exactly
basically, in the final analysis, when you define a government, the government in most cases has a monopoly on violence
It does.
and keeps that from the people, and that's how they stay in power.
Well, you know, this is a very interesting point, because we're talking reality and ideal. And I'm in the middle of that. And what's very important for us to understand is the reality of violence. And we're looking at Chinese culture and civilization. And we're also looking, maybe I put too much emphasis on the political components of organization and nation building. The nation, for example, we have myths, national myths, don't we? Don't we have national myths? Look at the Egyptians, for example, and they have goddesses and gods and all of those, right? Entombed and so on and so forth. The Japanese, they had the idea that their emperor was of divine descent, not to be confused with the French idea of Bossuet, his idea of divine rights. The Chinese have the idea, again, of the mandate of heaven. There's this link of a kind of transcendent authority. The Chinese have this moral authority. When we look at power, power is fundamental to the establishment of a nation state. So when we look at the establishment of China, which we are really getting into right now, it is through violence, it is through military power, it is through deception. So how do we, in the 21st century, how do we make sense of this without being maybe perhaps contradictory in our own beliefs and convictions of peace? Do you understand what I'm saying? So power, military force, is fundamental in the relationship and the correlation between establishment of a state and culture. Does that make sense to you? Can anyone challenge it? I can. If you want me. We're carrying on, but just keep that in mind. It's very, very important. We know now that the military, after the breakdown of the Han Dynasty, that it's up for grabs. But there's one thing that is pervasive. And what do you think that one quality, one factor in this equation is between military and nation building?
Could you speak a little bit louder?
Yes,
We're back
yes.
here.
What is that
Project.
one is, I'm sorry, please let me know, because I'm not a very loud person. But can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. What is that one factor in the equation between military power and civilization and the creation and success of cultural inheritance? I gave a clue away. Well, what do you think that one factor is that is ever so prevalent? Yeah. Okay, one.
Well,
Yes.
I don't know about, I think of two things, hope and hate.
Hope and hate. Wow, that's an interesting thing. Wow. I think that's probably very real. Hope is much better than to expect. Just hope, never expect. I really think, from my limited experience, to hope is always better, but the hate is real. Yes, it's real.
Well, we have like the children are coming from Mexico and coming here with hope. We think they have hope. Yet we have hate against it.
What is the hate? Well, what is the hate?
Fear.
Fear of the
Fear.
something that is unknown. Okay, that's the right one. Now let's keep that in mind with China too. Okay, yeah.
I think it's more of a fear that there's no law.
Okay, and the rule of
Just
law.
do whatever you do.
The rule of law.
I think that
Okay.
confuses.
Yes, it does. Yes, very good. Well, let me carry on, and this, you're building the context, actually, of what's happening in China. Because this period in China is overwhelmed. The Han Dynasty collapses, but yet you have an aristocracy who claim hereditary rule. They create an aristocracy as the preserve of Chinese tradition, culture, and law, and rule, and very much based on Confucian principles. And you have other vying people coming in from outside, from the northwest of China, coming in. Basically, this is what I'm talking about here. So you've got all of this happening, okay? And that's exactly what's happening in China as central authority declines. Well, I'm not going to go into a discussion about what leads to the decline of power. That's something separate. In this case, we can simply talk about the fragmentation and the indulgence of those who were in power, personal indulgence, the distraction from the ideals and the mandate to rule. The balance between political power, military power, and social integration and social well-being was neglected. And that's probably one of the best things to understand in terms of whenever there is political turmoil, social turmoil, this is a natural response. Wouldn't you agree? The military is there for a particular purpose. It is contained. Military rule is contained. And in Chinese history, military power, as you'll see, has always taken the opportunity, those leaders, those clever individuals, and I'm not saying only men. Wait until you hear the story here of our empress. She's coming up in a few seconds. She's quite someone. And I have a beautiful film that I would like to show, but that, we'll get into that, remind me. When we talk about the balance of power, we're not talking about between nations, we're talking about within a community of people. The whole idea of a nation, the whole idea of a state is a thoroughly, for us in the West, is entirely modern, only from the 19th century. For the Chinese, this was a way of life, a way of organization according to certain particular principles. Confucianism prevails. It prevails in the sense of keeping a check on people in power, people in the military. And then what is it based on, really? I would argue it's based on human reason.
On what?
Human reason. So what happens here in this period from the fall of the Han up until the 6th century, we were talking about 250 years, is a period of chaos. Now, in the period of chaos, what happens is we have a number of beautiful developments. And I would like to keep those ideas for you to keep those, and you have these notes, and keep these ideas in mind. One is the role of the aristocracy, and this is something contrary to any American. If we were to define, I'll ask the question, is there an aristocracy in the United States?
Yes.
Yes. No, who, where? How do you find it? Where do you find it? Who are they?
But I,
And the Hilton.
I'm sorry, yes?
Rich.
Oh, I can't get that thing so
Super rich.
blind. Yeah, sorry.
The super rich.
Oh, yes, the super rich. And you were going to say something, Doctor?
Also politically.
Politically elite. So we have the financially elite, politically elite. Anyone else? Any other ideas?
This is a wealth.
It's always wealth for Americans. Wow. How interesting. What do you make of the Biddles? The Drexel Biddles.
aristocracy.
Oh, there we go, there we go. And it's based on wealth, power, and
Influence.
oh yes, of course, once you have all of that. So that's the nature of aristocracy.
You had a wealth of thoughts at some point, even in the revolution.
Yeah.
Tom Paine had no money, almost no money, but he started writing
This
and
is
getting
very,
the
this
ideas.
is what I think. This is what I think. I think that America, the wealth of Americans is in their ideas. We need money to live, to eat, to survive, to share, to give. We need to be practical. But we also have to have it based, our ideas are create the foundation of our wealth, not our money, if that makes any sense. We need money. In the sense that, gosh golly, I have to feed my dog, I have to, feed me. I forget sometimes, but not Pippin, my puppy. But
What you
we
need is a
need
credit card.
practical concerns. But I think the wealth of the United States is more, not so much on the material wealth, but on the ideas. And please disagree. Please, oh, go ahead,
I
please.
would like to think you're right, but even.
The reality here.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
good, good.
Even with the best of ideas,
Yeah, I know, that's it.
you're alone, you sit in a room by yourself. The minute
Yeah.
you want to go out and spread them to the world, you need money to do that.
Yes, there's nothing wrong with that.
And then there's
But you're not alone,
corruption.
but you have the foundational principle. And so you get the money and give it, you just said it, to create a proper society, community of people.
Except the people who give the money want to create that. They see that proper society in the way they perceive it. It might be very
Oh,
different
they're very,
from the way
very.
someone else
Did you
perceives
hear
it.
everything here? We're talking about, I'm sorry, we're talking about the source of wealth and how, if we have money, the idea, my argument was the ideas are very important, but the practical element is, what do you do with it? So we're looking at a dichotomy here, which is very real in our world, very real in Chinese history. And this is very relevant in helping us understand the nature of communism and what will prevail. So this question here is, you've got the money, but how do you work with it? How do you go out there in the real world? How do you, I have many examples in my mind. I'll give you one, if that's all right. If it's all right. There's a wonderful grocery store up on where I live, on Germantown Avenue. And I'll go in there, and the manager apparently knows me. I go in there to buy something, vegetable or whatever, nothing much. And then the manager and I became friends, and so I said, I told her that I'm working with this group of people to help distribute food to the poor. So I came home with 4 big boxes of food. So then my problem was, the problem was not just, that was one problem. The problem, I think, what you're raising is, how do we integrate the idea of the source of wealth and those who need it. The problem of integration, this is something I just thought of right now, is a very important problem, rather than distribution of wealth. How do we integrate the source of human integrity and wealth? The wealth of the human person. Yes. Okay. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. Yes.
I'm just thinking of Huey.
The other
Long.
peculiarity in the United States, I'm sorry, he first?
So you're first. 1,
Okay.
2, 3.
The other
Yeah.
peculiarity in the United States is the strength of our military, but the rule of law sort of divorces the military from the aristocracy, and the military is sort of boxed. And in many other governments, the military was sort of entwined with the aristocracy, and here it's boxed.
Right.
because there's certain rules that the military cannot
Called
exceed.
constitutional order.
That's right.
Right, right. Okay, member two, yes.
I don't,
I can take this.
I'm
Very
not
good.
sure, I'm not sure if at this time in our country that there's an agreement on what the principles are that you're alluding to.
Oh, that's quite right. And I think this is what I'm raising the issues. That's why I brought this up, because I see tremendous relevance to the breakdown of the Han political, Chinese political order. And if we can make some kind of relevance to the chaos that ensued with the breakdown of this common perception of what is right and wrong, what is socially acceptable, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense? Yes. And then, yes.
2 points. One, this breakdown of chaos reminds me so much of the Bible Shove team,
Yes.
where a ruler would come and bing, bang, bang, and we followed the ruler followed the Torah, and he did all right, and then when he died, at the end of that, chaos again. So this reminds me a lot of that. Second of all, the rise of populism in this country, I'm thinking of Huey P. Long, who,
Yeah, I know.
I'm from Louisiana.
Yeah, yeah.
Against with Huey P. Long. But anyway, you remember what Huey P. Long said, "Why weep in slumber, America, land of brave and true. Prosperity is waiting for everyone. It's waiting for me and you." So in other words, he was
With the
selling the
exception
idea
of-
of prosperity to the masses, every man a king.
Yes. The base, you're talking about populism, what is the basis of this argument? And that's what we have to look at. And it was racism, it was hatred. If you can hear me, it was racism, hatred. I don't think you're offended by criticizing the law. Does that make sense?
That was part of his plan. Everybody was poor, not just the whites
Okay.
and the black. Everybody was poor, and he
And-
was putting out forward to you, every man a king.
Every white man a
The
king.
means, yes, but the means, in other words, the end can never be justified by the means. There's just no way.
I'm not saying Huey P. Long
No, I
was
know
right,
that, but this is a
but I'm
good,
saying this was
this is
his
exactly,
message.
this is the nature of political power. This is the put that into Chinese context. They haven't, the Chinese, I mean, we're all human beings. And it's a matter of, now we're at that point where we can question political power and the sources of power, but I'll get back to that in a second. Yes?
I think there's another element, like in the rise of communism, and why people would go toward a faith like communism as opposed to the
Sure.
beauty of Buddhism, and that would be
Well, that's what I
freedom.
want to get into, yes.
Well, freedom versus security, when you think about it.
So freedom versus security. Freedom versus security. Freedom.
Well, there was a parable in the novel by the existentialist writer Dostoevsky
Yeah.
and the brothers Karamazov.
Sure, sure.
One of the brothers, they're sitting around talking, and one of the brothers said that Jesus went to the flock, and he said, "Follow me, and you'll have security," or "Don't follow me, and you'll have freedom." And if you have someone, of course that was in a religious context, but if you have someone who says, "I will take care of you, I'll protect you, follow my dictates, you'll be safe,"
That will never happen.
versus freedom.
Right. Well, oh, okay, I got that. That's a literary point, but we'll keep that in mind when we talk about communism and Dostoevsky. But I want to go back to the question here about the nature of chaos and political authority, but I do want to keep these things in mind. In regard to China, I think that what we have here is the same kinds of concern in terms of security, in terms of faith. When we talk about faith, you have to, again, I don't want to be cynical, but we're looking at institutions of faith. But I'm going to say something different. faith is beyond the institution. Faith is something that we're given. It's a gift. It's a gift from God. It's a receptiveness. If I can say the word God in this congregation, if I can. Because sometimes I cannot use the word God. A gift, faith is a gift of God. And this is what I think is missing. We'll talk about the Dostoevsky issue here. But something is lacking, but it is real. Dostoevsky is real, looking at everyday life. And if you were thinking, for example, when you wake up in the morning, what's the first thing you want to do? You want to brush your teeth, you want to take your shower, and then get dressed and take Pippin out for his walkies, and everything is ordered, and come to class and do things like that. But is God involved in our lives? You see, this gift of faith in God is so important. Now, how do the Chinese deal with this idea? And how do people who don't understand the nature of God understand all of this? And how do we approach other cultures? You see?
Confucian was principles were different. That you not have, in my idea, that I have very little knowledge, that you have some principles, not necessarily small God, going to a particular religion, this religion, or that religion.
Correct.
The principles were still there.
The principles
Yes.
are based on fundamental universal values. And this is something that somewhere along the line, now this is me speaking, please, I'm responsible for this, that we lost our faith in the human person, the dignity of the human person, the value. There's nothing in the world that is more valuable than the human person. Who bestows value upon things? What is the separation between a person and a thing? Idea and a thing. We lost somewhere along the line that discrepancy, that value, ability to make that value judgment. Based on that principle, it doesn't mean if a student is, for example, if a person is doing ill things, bad things, we have judgment, we have laws, we have constitutional principles, which are based on the fundamental reason. So maybe in American history we have this kind of imbalance between the idea of reason and God. That's a very delicate balance that if you look at our original of our papers, we're not meant, but in American history, we will protect religious practices to the extent that they're within reason. Does that make sense? So reason and religion and faith are not necessarily incompatible. I'm jumping leaps and bounds, but I'm just trying to put a balance on this. And I think this is also, well, we have a particular culture, a particular faith. It has to be within reason. And there's also the divine element, which I don't want us, I will never forget. So I don't think we should. So.
You had I'm sorry to...
No.
The independence, the Declaration of Independence was very nice ideas.
There we go back to our ideals and reality. Yes, I agree with this. But this is my argument, and I wrote a book or something on this. But in other words, if ideals are not grounded in reality, they're not ideals. It doesn't make any sense. They have to be grounded in reality, if that makes any sense to Dostoevsky. And I think it kind of makes sense. We're not living in a bubble. We're not living in a vacuum. We're living with each other. And that's what we forget. Every day we forget. So ideals are grounded in reality. And the reality is the dignity of the human person, the beauty of the human. Nothing else comes in terms of evaluative judgment comes from anywhere but the person. And that's the power of the person. The human. I'm not talking about rampant individualism. I'm not talking about any of those things. But this is something that comes out through Chinese history. Hey, look, I'm suffering, I'm starving. You have houses of nobility who they refuse to give into this new emperor during this confused time. They all starve to death. I think they're nuts. You know? They're not rational. Compromise, work with people, negotiate. You see? Yes.
Well, in
That was my
China,
opinion. So.
right, in China, it's the state that's important rather than the individual.
That's what we're getting into. Exactly right.
So,
Mm-hmm. Correct.
so that would suggest, if you follow your reasoning, that their government makes no sense.
When you have the death and the death of reasoning, the rational power of a human person, the denial of the dignity of the human person, then you have the death of anything. Nothing can sustain itself. It cannot. Because human history has taught us we will survive. We will survive. Based on our, whether inarticulate perception of our dignity, or rather maybe sometimes maybe too articulate, but we still will. We know the source of value and judgment. No one else can do it. There's nothing else but us. Now let me make a few brief comments in terms of Buddhism. And this, I do have a map, but I'm not going to burden you with it. I will give you the map, but I want to just mention a few things, and you probably you're much more knowledgeable than I in terms of these things, but a few key principles in terms of how Buddhism came into play during this period of chaos. It's amazing, isn't it? When we talked last Monday about millenarianism and how there was a period of chaos and people were looking at magic and mystery and mystics and all of these things. Buddhism now comes into play when we're talking about 7th century, 6th century AD China. Now Buddhism, as you know, I'm sure, of course, is a little bit older than that, but it makes its way into China. And coming from India, based, of course, on the experiences and the teachings of Gautama, and his students writing them down and creating a sort of discipline. It's very interesting when you have Confucius doesn't write a thing apparently, and then his students write everything down. Now we have Buddha. He doesn't write necessarily anything, but his students write everything down. Good students. I wish I had them, sometimes. I do actually. So I'm very happy with my history students. But now this is a very interesting situation. You have a teaching here that is pronouncing the nature of life and describing amongst this chaos the reasons for this chaos. How about that? Now isn't it interesting, look at California and the terrible things that are happening in our world. Everywhere you look, if you watch the news, it's just terrible. It's kind of disconcerting. I wouldn't jump in there and fix it. Can't outdo it. You can do one thing though. One thing, maybe correct something. Maybe that major gadget, the wheel of things. But amongst this chaos, we've got this teaching coming in from India, going across from India, going across from the Hindu Kush, of course, which is in the north, I should say actually, the northeastern part of India, over here, traveling across throughout India, directly going into Inner Mongolia, going directly then also into China, and then the southern route. I'm going to make a map of this for everyone so you have it. Don't worry. And it just simply dominates the whole geography of Asia. It's a fascinating situation where we have the basic teachings of course, this one rather interesting fellow, and he comes up with, basically, for our purposes, 4 interesting elements of what Buddhism is. And what do you know? What do we know of Buddhism? Well, first of all, suffering exists, right? The world isn't really very pleasant sometimes. I would say, if anyone had a conscience, it's not really very pleasant at all. For our sanity, we have to know how to balance our awareness. Number 2, what's the cause of the suffering? Right? Number 3, the cause is what? Desire. We want. At what expense? And number 4 is it can be corrected. It can be. So you were talking about hope. This is hope. It can be correct, and I'm a big proponent of that too. I'm not quite cynical, but I am not pessimistic. I'm observant, put it that way. There's hope. Now, how do we cultivate these 4 basic realities of reality? In other words, basic truths of reality. The Eightfold Noble Path, in other words, basic, simple things. It's not that simple, though, as you'll see. What is right, do what is right, do what is good, do what is... It's all, again, based on reason. Now, the problem that you must immediately ask, how do we know what is right? How do we know what is true? How do we know what is just? How do we know what is beautiful? How do we know these things? You see? Well, I think if you were basically what Buddha is telling us is to basically divest yourself of all the distractions of life and look at what is real. And I guess I'm looking at you, doctor. I think this, when you go into surgery, or if you were, or you know exactly, if I'm a professor, I know exactly what the student is writing. You see the truth, and you see where you're wrong, you see where you're right. Truth is an objective reality. And to deny that raises elements of doubt, which then creates confusion. So if you're in a Buddhist environment, you're going to divest yourself of all of those elements. You want peace, you want harmony, you want to get to your true nature. It's not easy to even describe. But the one other element I wanted to say today, I didn't expect to speak so long in terms of Buddhism, but the impact that it had, and this is a very important point, the impact that it had is here with us today. It's here today. It's not so strong in China, interestingly enough, even though there are many thousands of temples, but the government came down very hard. The Tang government came down, the government of China, and that, I'm going to just say one thing, and I'll give you notes and then we'll pick it up and then we'll move on, but this is important. The Tang government, the power of the people, the Tang government of China is what replaced, after 250 years of civil war in China. The Tang government came into power not by peace, not by Buddhism, but by military force. To give you an example, we're talking about simply the killing of 59 princesses, 59 members who claimed direct rule from the original Han dynasty. So we do see a cultural degree of continuity. Political ideals are there, but it's during this period of the Tang period, 581 to 907. I guess we would basically make a correlation to medieval Europe, Charlemagne, something like that. Charlemagne's 800, something in there. We have a unification now of China, based on the principles of Zhang and Zhou, Han. That's their cultural legitimacy. The cultural legitimacy gives them the political claim. And this is something that's very important. We haven't experienced it, but we're in the maybe contemporary period. If we look at our cultural, we're a very young country with a very short history. Europe is too complicated, but China is looking at its cultural pedigree. It's basing its political legitimacy on what had preceded them. Whether they make that up in terms of whoever is going to be the military ruler, whoever is which obviously it is. These are military people taking control of China and unifying them. And it establishes again the basis of China from Tang in the 6th century, well into the 20th century. But it's based on cultural legitimacy. Cultural legitimacy. Politics and military, they can interplay, but the pedigree of cultural legitimacy is very, very important. Does that make sense? Here in the United States, we talk about, well, I'm a Scotsman, something like that. Who cares? I'm in Philadelphia. My ancestors lived here forever, Or I'm maybe German. The largest population is German. That's one. But why, we identify with that? Isn't that interesting? The Chinese know they're Chinese. And they will know whether they're Han Chinese or not Han Chinese. So we have the question now of cultural legitimacy as a powerful point of political and military power and stability. This will last for the Tang period, okay? It will continue. But the Chinese are not necessarily a pure race. The Tang dynasty is a period of incredible cosmopolitanism where they're interacting with the Jews, they're interacting with the Arabs, they're in the Silk Road. Buddhism is okay, but maybe we don't like it. Confucianism as our cultural source of legitimacy. We're going to now also, Buddhism moves into Korea and Japan, where it stays. It doesn't stay in China. Buddhism doesn't survive in China. It survives in Korea and it survives in Japan. Very, very, very much. Confucianism prevails because Confucianism is a rational order. It makes sense of things. Or people can make use of it to make sense and to make them justified as rulers. But it's during the Tang period that we have, for the first time, a tremendous degree of cosmopolitanism in China. Up until the 21st century. We didn't have, as you'll see, the 19th century is a terrible period. The 19th century to the 20th century is a very bleak period for China. But if you look back at the accomplishments in art, literature, poetry, then you'll see how great this period in Chinese history is during the time. And you can go to the Philadelphia Art Museum. Go in there, go up, and go in the back, and make a left. you'll see all of the artifacts from the Tang period. Why do we have them? You see, we have them. We bought them because during the cultural 20th century, 19th century, we bought them. They had their share. They want to buy them back. But this is their history. And every aspect of Asian aesthetics is based on this period. From the 6th century to the 10th century is the basis of Asian aesthetics. You'll find it in Tang culture. Not only that, they also provided, based on Buddhism and Confucianism, with the integration and the melding of those two, they were not necessarily contradictory, but they combined them to provide a form of government for neighboring nations based on these principles of Buddhism and Confucianism, and in the case of Japan, maybe Shintoism, never conflicted. What do we have? Basic principles of human behavior and government. And there's a heavy moral component to all of that. And we'll pick up with that. We'll go into engineering and art, and then we go into, of course, the final stages, China, which is the Manchu, looking at the Ming and the Qing. And that's it. We're pretty much on our way. But think of questions.